and that haggis. Now, Gonzalo Lira is actually under bombardment. The building next to him was hit just yesterday. As I understand it, on another broadcast earlier today, he disappeared halfway through because all his lights went out. It is extraordinary that this man has the clarity and the courage to continue to tell the truth about what's happening in Ukraine. He's in Kharkov, but he joins you now for the global audience that loves to see him so much. Gonzalo, the fall of Solidar, the potential now evacuation of Bakhmut, the extraordinary bombardment of virtually every important Ukrainian city over the last 48 hours. The war has begun to turn big time, hasn't it?
Yes, it most certainly has. And first of all, thank you so much for having me on. And thank you so much for your very, very kind words. You know that I'm a huge fan of yours, and I will always thank you for, paying attention to me and looking after me and that unpleasantness back in April. No, and in fact, you mentioned that the building next to mine had been struck. It wasn't yesterday. It was back in early September when the missile strikes started happening. And so, yeah, I got great photographs, but I can't show them because they give away my current location. But privately, I'm happy to send you the pictures because they're pretty cool. Anyway, the point is, yeah, what's going on now in the front in the Donbass region is that you see, since the start of this war, the Kiev regime installed basically 3 lines of defense, and the Russians have been grinding through them. Now, the first line of defense was Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Popasnaya, that line, which was breached in July 1st, I believe, of 2022. And here, they now the Russians have been grinding through the second line of defense, which is the Bakhmut line. And Soledar is essentially a suburb. It's a separate town, but basically a suburb of Bakhmut. It's a city or town of 10,000 people before the start of this conflict. And it mattered because, you see, this line of Bakhmut-Soledar, north-south line, basically was the second and perhaps the strongest line of defense that the Kiev regime had installed. They'd been building these defenses for the past 7-8 years since the signing of Minsk II agreements. And so the capture of Soledar is a very important moment. It's basically the penultimate town of the penultimate defensive line. You see, once they captured Soledar, they have essentially encircled the city of Bakhmut. There's only one road of escape for Bakhmut. And what the Zelensky regime is doing is that they are actually trying to hold on to Bakhmut by pouring more troops into it, which is incredibly demoralizing because the troops realize that they're going into certain death. And so, they're just throwing away lives willy-nilly. A lot of people are saying in the West that Soledar and Bakhmut don't matter. They do enormously, because you see, this was the centerpiece of the defensive line to hold back any Russian onslaught. And once your defensive lines are fully breached, there's nothing holding them back. Okay. And furthermore, the city of Bakhmut is a very important transportation hub. Several highways and several train lines cross through it. And so that's why, excuse me, it was a centerpiece of the second defensive line of the Kiev regime. Now, after the Russians finally breach through this second line, once they have captured Bakhmut, which will not be tomorrow, it'll take a few days, if perhaps not even a couple of weeks. But once they finally do capture it, the only further line, the third defensive line, is on the city of Kramatorsk. But this third line is the weakest of the lines. And beyond that, once they have overrun Kramatorsk, which would be inevitable because it's much easier to overrun it than the current Bakhmut line, then there's going to be basically clear sailing. I mean, just a flat terrain with no defensive positions between Kramatorsk and the city of Dnipro, formerly Dnipropetrovsk, which is on the Dnieper River. This would essentially mean that the Russians would capture the bulk of eastern Ukraine. This would be a huge deal. And the way things are going, this is an inevitability because Soledar has been captured. Bakhmut is about to be captured. It's encircled by three sides. Of the three roads leading out of it, two of them are controlled by the Russians, either fire control or they have outright possession of the roads. So the forces in Bakhmut have only a single road out. It's not under fire control, but it eventually will be under fire control. And so once Bakhmut falls, the next line will be Kramatorsk, which is far weaker than the Bakhmut line. And once the Russians overrun that line, then that would be the ball game insofar as eastern Ukraine is concerned. And so there's a lot of speculation going on insofar as the offensives that are gaining pace, because it's clear that the Russians are preparing a big winter offensive, but nobody's quite sure where. At this time, it's credibly estimated that 650,000 Russian soldiers are on the borders of Ukraine. A big grouping is in southern Belarus, just across the border from Ukraine, from the northern border, the northwestern border of Ukraine. Another big grouping is in the Belgorod Oblast, which is literally 50 kilometers away from my position. And then there's the third grouping that's in the Donbass region and the south of the country. It's sort of like spread out. It's not as concentrated as the other two. And so nobody's quite sure what the Russians have in mind. Of course, the Russians probably have a very clear idea of what they're about to do, but they're just not telling anybody. And there's, operational security has been incredibly good. So nobody has any clue, any realistic idea of what the Russians are going to do next. But we have reached a key moment in this battle, in this war, rather. See, the breaching of the second line, and the fact that Soledar has fallen and Bakhmut is all but done. It's inevitable. There's no way to save it. No number of troops will save it, because the defensive fortifications have already been destroyed. And so even if more soldiers flood into it, they will not be in positions to defend themselves from the Russian onslaught. So Bakhmut is done. Okay, it's just a matter of time. And so from that perspective, you realize that we have tipped over insofar as the conflict and in its totality is concerned. Because if we think of the conflict starting on February 24th, as initially it was an expeditionary force that the Russians launched to essentially scare the Zelensky regime into negotiations. And that failed into the spring. And so in the summer, they reorganized and they started really in September for this grinding, constant offensive. Well, we're seeing the culmination of that grinding offensive that has just ground down the Ukrainian armed forces. And so now we're at the position where the Russians will